First of all, thank you all for coming to my presentation, Punctuated Equilibrium, Neoteny, and Evolution, tribute to the late Stephen Jay Gould. I want to go over my feelings about this. Feel free at any time if you want to make a comment or ask a question. I have my local chat open. Just feel to put whatever you prefer in there. Would rather you not use voice. But I don't have a problem. If you want to put a question, just put question in capital letters, and I'll be happy to address things as we go along. I don't have long lectures. I actually prefer more discussions, question answers. So let's go to the first slide. I have a picture of Steve Gould, who was around from 1941 to 2002. And let me know if I'm going too fast on the slides. I'm going to wait until things res so that I could read them, and I'm going to presume that you can read them as well. But again, if you're having problems, so we can fix that. All right. So I grew up with Steve Gould, and I want to thank Chantel for putting a T-Rex skeleton, which is very appropriate. Steve Gould was famous for saying that he got interested in evolution, paleontology, and geology at the age of 5 when he visited the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. And that started his love affair with science. So I'm grateful that the T-Rex skeleton is there. I grew up with Steve Gould. I joined the American Museum of Natural History and subscribed to Natural History magazine and eagerly awaited every one of his columns, all 300 of them on a wide range of topics. I eventually went to Cornell University, where I got to talk to some scientists there, John Sisney, who recommended that I contact Steve Gould. And back in the 1970s, when I was in college, there was a group of scientists, I believe they called them the BLM, the Biological, MBL, Modern Biological Labs Group, and it included Steve Gould, Dave Raup, Tom Schaap, Jack Zepkowski. It was the all-stars in science, as I call them. And they would get together and discuss various science topics and then publish in Paleobiology magazine. And I'm going to say a little bit more about that MBL group and some of the accomplishments that they do. While at Cornell, I was able to send a few letters to Dr. Gould, and I'm going to explain to him I'll explain to you what the context was. Those letters have never been published. They've been locked up for all the years, and I felt that what better venue to release them on but the Science Circle. So I'll be giving you that download link. I've scanned those few letters in so that you can read for yourself what Dr. Gould had to say. While I was at Cornell, Steve Gould came to give a lecture on punctuated equilibrium. He and Niles Eldredge had just published this theory that really took the scientific community in paleontology and biology by storm. So basically, for those of you that are not familiar with the theory, and I'm not sure who wouldn't be because it's so widespread now, Charles Darwin basically, when he published on the origin of species, came up with a model called Phyletic gradualism. That is that evolution changes by slow, gradual, and progressive changes over time. And that model really was really what dominated paleontologists' thinking for so many years. Here's a graph that I got out of the classic Invertebrate Paleontology book by Morlock and Fisher, published in 1952, showing a gradual shift in the shape of organisms, the morphology over geologic time. So the idea is that organisms and populations change very slowly but progressively over time. And Niles Eldredge and Steve Gould, as a result of their PhD dissertations, said that that's probably not the way that evolution works most of the time. And I remember when Steve Gould came to Cornell and lectured on this very topic, he gave some examples of what were considered classic phyletic gradualism. And the first one that he had on his slides was the Irish elk, which Gould explained is neither Irish nor an elk. But the story goes that this animal was found, and what people thought was that the horns on this creature got so heavy that the poor animal's head could not support them, and the animal fell to the ground and killed itself, which is totally ridiculous, but nonetheless was considered a prime example of phyletic gradualism nonetheless. All right, the other example of phyletic gradualism that was touted mostly over in Europe was the Jurassic clam Grayfia. And there we go. Now it looks like it's rezzed. You notice that Grayfia has a very interesting shape, and it's got a tightly coiled shell on the bottom, and then it's got almost a flat shell on the top. And the thinking was that this poor animal coiled itself to death. In other words, the coiling increased to the point where it couldn't open the shell, and then it couldn't get nutrients or oxygen in, and as a result, just died. And this was touted as the classic example of phyletic gradualism. I mean, schools couldn't wait to get their hands on Grayfia and prove that this is the way that evolution worked. Well, Gould went through, he was able to get some of the data, original data on Grayfia, or maybe he resampled some of the locations where it's based on, did the mathematical analysis and found out that Grayfia didn't coil itself to death at all. In fact, there was very little change in the shape. Instead, once you take into account differences in size, the shape is basically the same through geologic time. So Gould argued that this is another example where people were trying to fit the data to the theory, and it just wasn't working out very well. And I see someone put in something about the dodo bird. I'm not exactly sure how the dodo bird extinction would tie into this theory. These are just some of the examples that Gould came up with as how people were using this to support phyletic gradualism. It just doesn't work very well. So instead, Gould and Niles Eldredge in 1972, based on their work for their PhD dissertations, published an alternative model. And again, I'm waiting for the rezzing to occur. There we go. On the left of the diagram, you see this slow, gradual branching diagram of phyletic gradualism. On the right, you see the punctuated equilibrium model, which basically states that organisms go through time of stasis, where they maintain their shape and their features, what we call the morphology. And then there are abrupt periods in the geologic timescale where they undergo a dramatic shift, and that's what we mean by punctuated equilibrium. Gould was basing the punctuated equilibrium model on Bermudan land snails. What a great deal to get funding, I'm sure. Just go to Bermuda and study these creatures, whereas Niles Eldredge used Recapitulate trilobites. And here's a really good example of a Recapitulate trilobite that it was used in his PhD work. Niles Eldredge mostly worked in upstate New York, and I talked with my evaluator, really Serena. That's why we know so much about Hawaii. Everybody wants to write a grant to go there. But anyway, I was fortunate being in upstate New York that I was able to go to some of Niles Eldredge's place and resample some of his localities. And that's what I'm going to show you next. If you take a look, this is what a trilobite looks like. By the way, trilobites, as you can tell, are extinct relatives of horseshoe crabs and insects and so on. And of course, they died off 230 million years ago. Okay, Barragan asked the question, what is the equilibrium part of punctuated equilibrium? Punctuated means that you have rapid changes in the organism. Equilibrium means that once these changes occur, the organisms stay the same in terms of their morphology, their shape, and their organs, and they don't change. For example, let me go to the next slide. All right, I went and I recollected some of the samples, and I could tell why Niles Eldredge wanted this particular site. Normally, the eyes are not very well preserved, but in upstate New York, you get rows of eye tubercles along the eyes. And that's what I've shown here with the arrow. And what Eldredge did was he counted those rows of eye tubercles, and he found out that most of them had, I believe it was 18, but there were times where you would rapidly undergo changes, and there might be 16 or 15, something like that. That's the tricky part, okay, because in many cases the preservation is not good. In fact, a quick story, my son was going through the public school system here in Virginia. I remember asking some of the teachers about when he was in 7th grade, there was a state standard that said, quote, the students will examine and evaluate the evidence for evolution. And I asked some of the teachers at the middle school how they taught that. And the response I got was, we're in Virginia, we're in the Bible Belt. What are you kidding? What are you kidding? We're not going to teach evolution. We're just not going to do it. I said, it's in the state standards. So I took my son to the college, got out the material from Eldredge's site, and I said, evaluate the evidence. And I got to admit, it was tough counting those rows of eye tubercles, but he got the job done. All right, so anyway, I just love trilobites. I mean, most paleontologists the same way. About a year ago, I was coming back from vacation in New York, and I heard about a great spot in West Virginia to look for trilobites and other fossils. So I got off of I-81 on my way back to Virginia, and I was driving along the road, and something hit me. It was this subtle little cliff in the side of the road there, and I said, I got to stop. I just have the feeling that there's fossils there. I got out of my car, and this guy was sitting right on the side of the road waiting for me to pick him up. It's almost a complete Recapitulate trilobite from the Middle Devonian. And to give you an idea about how influential Niles Eldredge was in the 1990s, this trilobite was originally called Phacops rana. It was renamed to honor Eldredge to be Eldriops rana. But again, if you look carefully at the trilobite, again, you notice that even though I've got almost the complete fossil, unfortunately, the eyes are broken off. The good news is that this is a cast of a Recapitulate trilobite, and I was able to, by hunting around, locate the mold that goes along with it. And this specimen eventually got donated to the Virginia Museum of Natural History, along with about 10 or 11 other heads of these trilobites. So I'm hoping that down the road someone will redo Eldredge's study with using material in West Virginia. The good news, having worked at the Virginia Museum of Natural History, is we have specimens of these trilobites from a number of different horizons, from the early and the Middle Devonian. So it might be possible to look at not just their eye structures, but I'm also thinking about, there's lots of other characteristics that you could measure on these things, like the glabella, which is a central part of the animal, or the head. You've got the number of pleura that you could measure. So there's a lot of things that we could look at for this particular study. All right, so let me get back to the MBL, Modern Biological Labs group. One of the things that they were very interested in the 1970s is what caused evolution to occur. And this diagram is from a publication by Dr. Jack Sapkowski in Paleobiology magazine. And the shapes that you see here are what are called clade diagrams. Each one of those strips that you see in the diagram represents a part of the geologic time scale. If you look really close, there are 4 subdivisions: Precambrian, Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic. And then the shapes that you see there represent the number of families through time. So as you can tell, some of these diagrams show a rapid explosion of organisms through time. At the end of the Paleozoic, a lot of organisms died off. Some organisms, like bivalves or clams in the lower left, they start off really slow and then they explode through the Mesozoic and the Cenozoic. And in the 1970s, there was a lot of discussion going on at major universities about what is causing this. Is it a result of random factors or is it deterministic factors? Some people said that the great die-off at the end of the Paleozoic was the result of Pangea coming together. That's what I learned when I was at the University of Chicago from Tom Schopp. A number of publications came out like that. Later on in the 80s and 90s, of course, we started talking about, what killed off the dinosaurs and other organisms in the late Mesozoic. And that was attributed to an impact event from outer space. So those are examples of what we call deterministic factors. But there was also a lot of discussion in the literature about, could these evolutionary patterns be a result of random processes? And I remember those publications sparked an amazing amount of debate in the biological, geologic, and evolution and paleontological literature. I remember Charlie Thayer, he published a landmark article on how organisms adapt in the oceans and various characteristics. And at the end of this classic paper, he wrote, I don't see the point in advocating random reasons for evolutionary processes when deterministic factors are just as good. So he was clearly on the side of looking at deterministic reasons for why organisms evolve through time. Jack Sapkowski shot back and said, don't misunderstand what we're trying to say. And in a number of his publications said, I don't think anybody really thinks that evolution is truly a random process. He said that it might just be a result of the fact that we have processes that are going on that are so small, so complex, that it's hard to separate them. For example, think of flipping a coin. Most of us would say that that's a random process. We use it in the Super Bowl and other events to determine an outcome that we hope is random. But if you knew enough about the physics of, what your velocity of your flip of your finger was, what the air friction was, the number of flips that was occur, you could accurately predict whether it was going to be a heads or a tails. And that's the sort of argument that Jack Sapkowski made in a lot of the publications for this modern biological group. And yet it haunted people, which was really going on. But I think the other thing that was driving it was that in the 1970s, there was this transition in geology and paleontology and evolution. Scientists weren't content anymore just describing fossils like had been done for so many years. 70s were the time when the first mainframes were coming out. In the 80s, we started seeing microprocessors and mini computers coming out. People wanted to start collecting more data. And there was definitely an interest in statistical analysis. They started saying, well, we can't do traditional scientific method with independent variables and dependent variables like the chemists and the physicists can. Mike Shar, he's so lucky to be able to do that. Geologists, unfortunately, are stuck with experiments that have been done in the past. So as the result, they started asking questions like, what about a null hypothesis of randomness? If we can reject that, then we can look at more deterministic factors. All right, so Tuya is saying, do you include environmental factors which accelerate mutation as deterministic? I think back in the 60s and 70s, when I was in college, I learned about how evolution was a result of mutations to the DNA strand, and that was considered a major force, between, in driving evolution. And I don't think that's true. I mean, you look at Chernobyl, and there weren't many new species arising as a result of the nuclear leaks. I'm going to talk about another process, heterochrony, that's also been in the literature for many years in terms of evolution. All right. Yes, Adam is making a good distinction here between true randomness and complex unknown causes. But in the 70s and even today, there wasn't a lot of distinction between that. All right. So anyway, I started corresponding with Dr. Gould, and this was when I was getting my bachelor's degree. I was getting ready to go to graduate school, and I picked up a number. I said colleges. I applied to Yale, Harvard, and so on. And I started to ask Steve about did he have data on these clades, and could we look for instead of randomly simulating clades, to actually starting to analyze the data. And he said, absolutely, if you came to Harvard, that could be the sort of the focus of my PhD work. We got some more questions in here. Punctuation implies an accelerated mutation or accelerator selection for mutations. It could. I mean, the whole model of punctuated equilibrium was interpreted in so many different ways, and the driving mechanisms, I don't know if they were ever really specified. I know the creationists love the idea of punctuated equilibrium. They're going, aha, you see, God is, creating new species as a result of these punctuations. So there were a number of different interpretations about this theory. So anyway, unfortunately, I didn't go to Harvard. I was very tempted. I went to the University of Chicago for a variety of reasons. One of them was funding. I got full funding from the University of Chicago, but only loans from Harvard. But there was also a lot. There were great scientists at both. Go Big Red. And I really liked working there, but unfortunately, I lost touch with Steve Gould after I went to Chicago. And this leads me to the next question, which is sort of a lead-in of how does evolution proceed? And one of the thinkings is it's a result of heterochrony in the fossil record. And Steve Gould published a book when I was in Cornell called Ontogeny and Phylogeny, and it was a major work. Basically, he discusses the theories of recapitulation, neoteny, or paedomorphosis. So I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about those ideas in case you're not familiar with them. And I'm going to greatly oversimplify this. Obviously, you'd be much better off reading his book to fully understand. But I remember we discussed it at some length while I was at Cornell. And basically, the idea behind recapitulation is that as organisms go through time, basically they add stages to their life cycle. So, for example, imagine a caterpillar changes into a butterfly by changing the regulatory genes that make it up. Imagine if you were to add another stage to the butterfly. Who knows what it could be? But that's the way that a lot of scientists thought that evolution occurred. Rather than doing a lot of dramatic changes to the genes, mutations, most of which are lethal. If you change the regulatory genes, you're not as much a danger of putting the organism at risk. Yeah, good. Adam is bringing up the idea of a random walk. Back in the 70s and 80s, the computers were being used to generate random walks, generate random phylogenies based on probabilities of branching or dying off. And I was doing some of that, but like I said, when I talked with Dr. Gould, he was more interested in estimating what the probabilities of origination extinction were for various phylogenetic groups. Jack Skopkowski, I believe was in the late 1990s or early 2000s, published a whole paper in Science magazine on origination extinction rates in the fossil record, and that led to the 26 million year periodicity theory, that every 26 million years that organisms die off because you have these diversions from the normal extinction rates. Since then, Sapkowski and Rapp have dropped those ideas and said that was just a statistical manifestation. All right. Now, what Gould said is that there's actually another way of doing things, and it's called neoteny or paedomorphosis. And I have a different example here. And waiting for it to res. There we go. Okay. You all know about tadpoles and how they slowly change into frogs. Well, what if the tadpole grew larger, acquired the ability to sexually reproduce with other tadpoles, and basically became a separate species? Because presumably that new tadpole would not be able to reproduce with the frogs that are already around. But, oh yeah, we're going to get to that. Paragon, that's been my sort of pet theory. But anyway, to get back to this, we'll get into aliens later if you want to talk about that. But basically, what Gould said, Gould was much more a proponent and said that neoteny, also known as paedomorphosis, the shift towards juvenile characteristics, is much more common. In fact, the argument that Gould and Eldredge made was they didn't say that phyletic gradualism didn't occur. They never said that recapitulation doesn't occur. What they did was they said it happens so rarely that for all extensive purposes, it's not an important process in evolution, which is sort of an interesting argument. So it turns out if you go through the literature, the paleontological literature, there's just so many examples of neoteny or paedomorphosis. And again, wait for the slide to res. Come on. There we go. Okay. You might want to zoom in on this one, and I'll try and explain what's going on here. This shows a brachipod. And brachiopods, they sort of look like clams, but they're not. They have two shells. They have an opening in them called a pedicle foramen, which allows a fleshy tongue-like organ to stick out of it. And the juveniles tend to have this pedicle for anchoring themselves into the sediment. Well, what we found out is that what a lot of brachiopods do is they chop off the adult stage of the brachipod and maintain the pedicle. So this way, if the environment shifts towards shallower water, what will happen is that they can still anchor themselves into the sediment and not be swept away. So, Darwin said that species compete, and they do. But what we're also noticing is, based on neoteny, that it's not only a competition among adult species, but also between adults and children. And when adults compete with children, more often than not, the environment favors the juveniles in the fossil record. So they get selected away, and the juveniles are the one, if they persist, can take over and become the dominant species. All right, human junk DNA may code for latent physiology like wings and... That's right, we have now coded the DNA sequence in humans, and there's a lot of DNA in there that doesn't seem to have any purpose. In fact, forget about humans, let's talk about birds. I brought this up with Richard Bombach one time in Chicago about how birds might actually have dinosaur DNA on them, and we might just be able to turn it on. And he told me, oh gosh, the guys at Harvard looked at this, and that's not true. Well, years later, it came out that that is exactly true, and there are biologists and geneticists right now that are going on. They're turning on regulatory genes, and they're getting chickens with long tails because they have them. It's just that in chickens at a certain age, the proteins are turned off that shrink the tail of a chicken. But there's no reason why you can't have a chicken with a long tail, or a chicken change the genes so instead of a beak, it has teeth. Instead of scales, it has feathers. All of this is being done right now, okay, by geneticists. And it's so scary that somebody might succeed and come back with a dinosaur chicken. All right. One of the things I like to point out about Steve Gould is he was not only a top-notch scientist, but he also was extremely well-versed in explaining complicated concepts. Yeah, the Mickey Mouse essay. Steve, I had to put this in here. It was one of my favorite articles that Steve Gould wrote as a way of illustrating neoteny. And what he found was that if you look at Disney characters, what I want you to do is compare the drawing of Mickey Mouse on the left with the one on the right. And what you'll notice is the one on the left was an early version of Mickey Mouse. The one on the right is a later one. And cartoonists actually started to make Mickey Mouse with more juvenile characteristics, a bigger head, bigger eyes, whatever. And the reason they did that was to make them more attractive to people. We tend to, we all love babies and so on. So they said, why not make Mickey Mouse look more like a juvenile? And it worked. Okay. Gould argued that as you go through time, that Mickey Mouse underwent a neotenic evolution or a paedomorphic evolution, that its characteristics were more related to juveniles, okay, than to adults. All right, and all right. One of the things that I'm reading some of the comments. one of the things that is so impressive is the effect or the impact that punctuated equilibrium had on the scientific community. Again, I remember when I was in graduate school in the late 70s, early 80s, I heard that there were so many graduate students that were trying to test for punctuated equilibrium theory in various universities. I remember there was one, Mrs. Welch, who was working at the Virginia Tech, and she was analyzing these brachiopods. They're called Mucospirifer, which is one of my favorite brachiopods from the Middle Devonian. She did some really advanced studies, Fourier analysis of the brachiopod shell, and she analyzed, quote, number of different species of these brachiopods. And the result of her dissertation was that there weren't a variety of species of this brachiopod. There was really only one, and over geologic time, basically this animal stayed the same. And I remember talking to Richard Bombach, who was one of Miss Welch's advisors, and I was looking at her data, and I started saying, oh my gosh, there's no discussion of heterochrony here. She didn't look at neoteny at all, and I was absolutely convinced that these brachiopods had undergone changes as a result of paedomorphosis. So I had some of my students, we tried to study, see if that was actually the case. If you look really closely at these brachiopods, one of the things that's nice about them is many of them still record the growth rings. So you can analyze each growth ring as a measure of the ontogeny or the life history of the brachiopod. All right. There was one other lecture that I went to by Steve Gould. This was in the late 1990s at Virginia Tech. I'd finished my PhD dissertation, and I was teaching a class on paleontology at Ferrum College. And Steve Gould came from Harvard down to Virginia Tech, and his topic was human evolution. And what's really interesting was, in my letters and my correspondence, Steve Gould was, in my mind, clearly very interested in looking at actual data and seeing what the patterns of evolution were. But he started off this lecture on human evolution by talking about the Civil War, which sort of surprised me. And he said that if you look at the events of the Civil War, one of the things that you realize is that a lot of the battles were not a result of deterministic factors. It was, in many cases, random things that determined who was going to win. Often the opposing sides did not know how many soldiers were on the battlefield. They would come up and they didn't know whether it was 10 guys there or thousands. And as a result, a lot of the battles could have gone either way. Gould even went on to say that, the Confederate forces could have taken over, could have won in Pennsylvania and taken over, I know Geology Bob is going to love this one, taken over Washington, D.C., and or at least maintain the Confederate States of America, in which case Gould argued he would have needed a passport to come to speak in Virginia. And again, he was still concerned, even later in his career, about the role of randomness versus deterministic factors. Then he got into the whole discussion of evolution and human evolution, and about how in the late 1800s, how racism was blatant. People were very influenced, and scientists were influenced by Charles Darwin, and they would say things like, Charles Darwin knew that we had a problem with missing links. He knew that there would be these sort of gaps in the fossil record, so what scientists were doing is they'd say, well, we've got these simpler primates, and then we've got more advanced humans, and what's in between? Well, they said it was the African American man and there were a lot of studies that were done in the late 19th century trying to prove that you had simple primates and then blacks and then whites along the trail. And Gould made it very clear. He said that this was a preposterous idea, that that data was manipulated to try and prove this crazy thought about sort of a racist approach to evolution. Some of the examples he gave were, if you look at a gorilla, it has sort of a receding forehead. If you look at a modern human, the forehead is vertical. And you look at the ape man and, thank you, The Mismeasurement of Man, one of my favorite books by Goulds, which we can talk about in a minute. And what they would do is you look at a black man, he also has a vertical forehead. So what they would do is they would tilt the skull backward so it looked like the forehead was inclined, clearly manipulating the data. Or they would make arguments. For example, back in the 1800s, it was popular when a famous scientist died, they would open up his skull and they would measure the mass of the skull, of the brain, to try and determine, why this guy was so bright. They did it for Gauss, the famous mathematician. And the shocker was that they did a number of measurements on this where they measured the mass of Gauss's brain. And they went to Africa and they got some African Americans Africans who were dead. They opened up their skulls, and to their surprise, they found out the mass of the brains of the black man were the same as Gauss. So then they had to argue, oh my gosh, maybe Gauss just had more convolutions of the gray material, and that's what made him so much more superior to the black man. And Gould, I think, did an amazing job of illustrating how the late 1800s, racism in the scientific community was not only allowed, it was encouraged, it seems like, which of course led to social Darwinism, Hitler's misuse of Darwin's books and so on. But I thought it was an excellent lecture that he gave. All right. I just want to take a few minutes to talk to you all about Gould in terms of some personal reflections. Gould was extremely hardworking. A number of his colleagues even asked him, how can you crank out? I mean, he had all these 300 articles in Natural History magazine. He had numerous books that he had published on a wide variety of topics dealing with evolution and biology. He was a prolific lecturer. He ran a number of classes at Harvard University. And basically, when he was asked how he pulled all this off, he said, I don't sleep much. When he gets tired, he takes a 15-minute nap, and that refreshes him, and he goes back to work. Amazing, sort of. That's the way he did a lot of his work. I was fortunate back in the late 1970s to actually be able to visit him at Harvard University and in his office. And I remember his phone kept ringing, and one person was requesting him to give a lecture on evolution, and he replied that the topic of evolution is too broad. You have to narrow it down. Think about it and come back to me, and I'll, whether it's you want me to talk about Neoteny or talk about punctuated equilibrium. Tried to be nice to the guy, but clearly, it's sort of bothering him a little bit. And I remember him taking me out to the Harvard Faculty Club, and we talked a little bit more about his upcoming articles in Natural History magazine. Sleep less, more in Second Life. Well, as long as you come to the science circle, it's not a waste. One of the great shockers in my life was learning about that Gould died at the age of 61 in 2002. And I remember hearing a number of discussions about this as to why he died so early. And it turned out, unfortunately, that there was asbestos in his office at Harvard University that was never cleaned out, and we think that may have been one of the causes of his death. Irregardless or irrespective of what killed him, it was a huge tragedy to lose Gould at such an early age. I'm thinking at 61, that's my age right now, and how much more I still want to do. in terms of science, investigation, and teaching. And I'm sure Gould felt the same way. And it was a great loss to the scientific community. So this is about where I like to, I try and like to lecture for about 30 to 40 minutes and try and leave some time for questions and answers. This final slide here is my contact information. Feel free to contact me at wschmachtenberg@gmail.com. If you want a copy of the PowerPoint here, I've uploaded to my website. Just go to www.evwllc.co/Gould/Gould.ppx. If you want to read over the letters that I got from Steve Gould back in the 1970s, they're at a similar website, except it's .pdf. So I've scanned those in, and feel free to look over them. If you have any questions, feel free to please put them in local chat. I've tried to respond to them as we were going along. I remember there was one question about Neoteny and aliens, and that's something that I've always wondered about is, are aliens neotenic? You look, classic alien you think of, they've got big heads and big eyes, and I'd be curious to see who else has thought about that. That's a good question, Synergy. Humans have not been around very long. Maybe 1 million, 2 million years? I think most scientists would say that humans just haven't been around long enough to really undergo major changes. And if it's punctuated equilibria, let's see, what was I going to say here? Humans have not been around much for very long, so I'm not sure if they changed all that much. And we still may be a result of the punctuation. Thanks, Violet, for coming. Adam had a comment in local IM about the origin of life. Yeah, I guess it's a matter of what you consider to be a human. I'm reading over some of the comments that Stephen is putting in here. I have to admit, I haven't been kept up with the genetics. Yeah, I guess it's a matter of what you want to call a human. I tend to think of organisms that are walking erect with a vertical forehead. Oh, I'm absolutely convinced about co-evolutionary processes. If you look at, for example, insects and flowering plants clearly have co-evolved together. And I think that's true for a lot of different organisms that have co-evolved. Or it could be a matter of the Red Queen's hypothesis. Lee Van Valen discussed that an awful lot at, when I was at the University of Chicago, where one organism will get a little better, a prey might get better, and the predators might get better after that. All right, Surfer Bob is asking, what do you think caused the various rates of evolution that Gould proposed? Good question, Bob. I'm not sure that people understand what controls the rate of evolution. I know Jack Skopkowski tried to measure it, origination and extinction rates, and based on the Skopkowski papers, what we notice is that there's constantly background extinctions going on. There are background origination events that are going on, and then there are times where those extinction rates are increased. For example, at the end of the Ordovician, or the end of the Permian, or the end of the Mesozoic. So, for example, the end of the Ordovician may have been a result of extinction due to widespread glaciation in Africa, or the end of the Paleozoic might have been a result of the collision of Pangaea, or the impact event at the end of the Mesozoic. Yeah, global warming has also been advocated. All right, Adam said, what do you think about the origin of life and how did it start? Again, a very complicated question. Adam, are you talking about, by the way, can you put your comments in local so we all get them? When you talk about the origin of life, are you talking about, for example, the origin of organic compounds, the sort of Miller-Urey experiments, where they prove that you can go from inorganic compounds to organic ones? Are you talking about once organelles are established, there is this sort of symbiosis of organelles where we think that, for example, mitochondria and DNA may have come together to form cells? And then you have the whole thing of the terraforming of the atmosphere and the development of advanced organisms in the Vendian. You start seeing sort of worms and other critters coming around, or the beginning of the Paleozoic when most modern marine organisms occur, or there's the sort of the invasion of the land at the end of the Paleozoic. All right, seems to begin with organisms that have proteins, DNA, RNA. They can't be. Here's the problem. Adam, you really bring up a very good question, and especially I've worked with NASA on this. At one of their research facilities, and one of the big questions they want to know about is, how does life originate? What does it take for life to form? Jack Sapkowski got a lot of funding from NASA for this, try and document the development of life. And it turns out the Earth is a real lousy model, okay, for determining how life originates on a planet. We have basically we have a terrible gap. We know the Earth is about 4.56 billion years old. The oldest rocks on Earth are somewhere in the 4 billion year range. So that means we've got 500 million years where we know absolutely we know very little about what was happening on the planet. We have the oldest bacteria going back maybe 3.6 billion years. So the question is, how long does it take life to form on a planet? Or there's the panspermic theory that life evolved outer space somewhere and then was transported to the Earth via a meteor or comet or something like that. There was a theory published that a chunk of rock had a fossil bacteria in it that was transported to the Earth, and that idea has largely been discredited. The issue is the emergence of fantastic complexity. Second law of thermodynamics, that everything tends to move towards maximum entropy, is what I think Adam is going after. And it's true, except remember, entropy is for closed systems, and that's not, as I understand it. You've got energy from the sun is constantly bathing the surface of the Earth, which is what organisms use to fight entropy. But you're absolutely right. Left unchecked, that's the case. Where's Mike Shaw? He can tell us more about the second law of thermodynamics. I thought the oldest rocks were just, Bob is saying 4.2 billion years. Yeah, okay. That's about what I was saying, Bob. Let's see. We've got some people saying mitochondrium is more complex than an iPhone. Got some great comments coming here. I'm having trouble keeping up with them. Actually having increased complexity, generate heat better. Okay. My understanding, synergy, is that it's the sunlight that helps organism fight entropy. I guess we're ultimately all dead. So, I mean, that's the ultimate in entropy. Well, we're certainly warm-blooded, so we have to maintain a certain amount of heat to survive. Yeah, that's true too. Okay, through global warming. All right, do we have any other questions or comments? I'm hearing some great ideas here. Well, I'm getting a lot of comments about the politicians and making absurd comments about science. And I understand what you're saying. I think that, well, I think at least here in Virginia, we're fortunate that the people just elected a medical doctor, okay, to be governor of the state of Virginia. I'm hoping that will help. Oh, thanks, Stephen, for letting us know. Are his books available for free or just as essays? I'm not sure what Gould thought about dinosaurs. I see. Oh, okay. I'd like to read those. Steve, if you could send me the URL links, that would be great. I mean, you look at, I mean, there are some topics like global warming that are extremely politically dominant because it's environment versus um, economic issues. And a lot of the data can be interpreted one way or another based on what your feeling is. I hope you got something out of it, Thunder. I appreciate you coming. I think we're good to wrap this up. Chantel, do you have any announcements about upcoming presentations? I know this week is Virtual World's Best Practice in Education.